Good morning, everyone. Lovely to see you all here this morning. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Dr. Stephen Parissien. I'm a fellow here at Kellogg College. I'm also Director of Studies for Architectural History. Delighted to be joined by Philip Mould, who you all know, star of stage, screen and gallery. We're delighted to welcome you both in person and online to, we hope, an engaging and thought-provoking conversation about authenticity, about connoisseurship, about provenance, and where it fits in the art and architecture worlds. Firstly, just a couple of messages. This is, of course, the last lecture in the Meeting Minds series. We're delighted to have you with us at the end of what's been a hugely successful weekend with some fabulous talks. I'm sure many of you attended some, if not all of them. So we're delighted to have put this on, and we love having you back here at Kellogg College. It's been an absolute delight. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Obviously, you know where the fire exits are. There isn't going to be a fire drill, so if the bell goes off, do saunter purposefully towards that exit or that exit. If you need the toilet, tough, you should have gone before you came. No, the toilets, as you know, are up on my left there, but should you need them in a hurry. Welcome then to the climax, if you like, of the Meeting Minds weekend, where we're looking at authenticity and expectation, and the idea of what is truth and what isn't, particularly in fine art. Philip, so kind of you to join us today. Can I ask what brings you here? What's your background? Why are you on stage?
Good afternoon, incidentally. Good afternoon, everybody. I think just by help that. I'm sorry. It's glad to say what a real pleasure it is to be here. I came here last night for that opulent dinner. I've known Steve for many years. He's had some lustrous jobs in the museum world, and it's a real delight, a very warm feeling to be able to be in discussion in this cracking habitat, this collegiate habitat of Kellogg College. So just a tiny bit about me. So in real life, I suppose you could describe me as a second-hand picture dealer. I'm an art dealer. I have a gallery in the West End of London, but I deal in old art. I always have to tell people it's not contemporary art. I like my artists to be well and dead, if possible. And I've done this for about 35 years, been in the West End of London. And then about 13 years ago, I was asked to put together an idea following one of my books on art discoveries for a television program, which is now in its 45th program. It's 11th series. The next series is starting next week, called Fake or Fortune. It was originally called Sleuth after my last book, and then the BBC have a department. They have a room just for making up titles for programs. And I remember it was Fiona Bruce and myself who'd been presenting this for forever, from commencement, and then being told that it was called Fake or Fortune. And frankly, to us, it sounded a bit like a game show, but it's not. I promise you it's not. Although there is a sort of gaming element to it, which is to do with authenticity. So for those of you who haven't watched it, someone like Steve would come to us with a picture that he might have inherited. Let's say he thought it was a Monet, and then we would subject it. We'd get to know Steve a bit, and he'd come along the journey, as they say, and we'd subject it to forensic analysis, to stylistic analysis. We would look at the brushstrokes, and gradually we'd create a case over the course of an hour, often travelling extensively to do so. And then we present the details to one of the experts or group of experts in the art world, whose job it is, the sort of appointed people on earth, to work out what is real and what is not for the particular artistic question. And they have the power of Roman emperors, these people. It's an extraordinary evolutionary process by which they've got that power, and in France it's terrifyingly strong. If it's right, they put their thumbs up. Suddenly, a new painting is established in the oeuvre of an artist, and an extremely valuable one, which is nice for Steve. If not, it's omitted. It is not included, and it is sometimes almost worthless. So the stakes are quite high. Or as they say in the BBC, jeopardy. The jeopardy element is, in fact, a lot of modern television is about jeopardy. Anyway, so that's what the programme is for those who haven't seen it. And I am fascinated by the whole process, the whole subject, which we're talking about today, of how you go about proving what is real and what is not. Hence the fake or fortune type.
Thank you, Philip, really helpful. I'm just going to introduce the subject with, firstly, a piece of cityscape from just round the corner, just down the road. Here we are in Turl Street in Oxford, which is a lovely medieval street at the heart of Oxford University, except it's not. What you're looking at was in fact all refronted, tidied up, re-Gothicized in the early 19th century. Work started about 1805. All three colleges down this road, Exeter on the left, Lincoln further down the left, and Jesus on the right, all modernised, or as we say, Tudorised their frontages in the early 19th century. This is not just that, I'm not having a go, this is not to say that Turl Street is a lovely composition, but the idea was it's more a fantasy of what the street would have looked like, should have looked like in Henry VIII's time, rather than the actuality. I think it's important to, as Philip said, is to start looking at what is generally real. We have to look at history, we have to look at provenance, we have to look at records. And it doesn't devalue Turl Street in any way whatsoever. In fact, it makes its history perhaps rather more interesting, rather more exciting. So this is not a having a go at restoration. It's just trying to put it in context and using that word that's used by Ruskin, by William Morris, and everyone since, honesty, being honest. I'm just prefiguring some of the things that Philip and I'll be talking about in a minute. Let's look at an example I know I've cited before, but looking at a number of aspects here, the power of expectation. And we've all had this, haven't we? I really want this to be true. I really want this to be what I hope it is. And also, latterly, and Philip will particularly be talking more about this in a minute, the role these days of connoisseurship, of provenance, and particularly of science, which really has turned the game completely on its head. This is a lovely painting, supposedly the first oil painting of a horse race ever in Britain. Anyone who's a horse racing aficionado was waiting for this picture. How wonderful. This was acquired by the Royal Collection in around 1920. The then Royal Librarian, head of the collections, Owen Morshead, was absolutely delighted with this picture and wrote about it, saying, what a delightful little canvas. This is just what we hoped. He knew it was genuine because there had been an engraving of the picture which had survived by Francis Barlow of this same picture, the last race at Datchet, so a horse race of 1687. So as it normally goes, the engraving was presumably taken from that oil painting, and there we are. This has been a lost oil painting. How wonderful to have it in the Royal Collection. Of course, the Royal family have always been, particularly in modern era, very interested in horse racing. Well, impressively, the Royal Collection were the first to put their hands up more recently. And again, here we get to the science. Analysing the picture, they came across some rather surprising results and admitted it's not a 17th century picture, but it is early 20th century. And indeed, and here's where we get to the science. Here's an X-ray of that picture. It was created to fulfill that expectation in around 1900, 1910. So poor Owen Morshead was, he was duped. But hooray for the Royal Collection, they wrote about this. It was easy to perhaps fall for that because the canvas and the frame were 17th century. As this X-ray reveals, if you look on the left-hand side of the X-ray, they'd actually overpainted an Italian seascape. You see the ship on the left-hand side. Oh, shame you can't see that now. So, again, that made for a fascinating story. But what is real, what is not, and the power of expectation, please let it be true. And just another quick example in the same genre, and there's always a lot of money in good sporting art. When I was at Contaverni, which I hope you've all visited in your time, I was there for 10 years as director, we ran a big British folk art exhibition with Tate, and Tate were borrowing this picture from Yale, the wonderful Yale Centre for British Art. Same idea. This was celebrated as the first oil painting of a cricket match. I mean, think the money that will be around that. Probably, mid 18th century, just what we were waiting for. How wonderful is that? Well, Tate we're going to borrow this until finally some work done at Yale. The same result said, it's not around 1748, make that 1948. This had been created to fulfill that expectation, and we still hung it in the exhibition, but this time with an explanation. And again, it doesn't, I'm not saying on Tell Street, it doesn't detract from the narrative. In a way, it makes it even more interesting. But Philip, something that comes out in these, and please let me donate the clicker, in these examples is the role of connoisseurship. In this sense, connoisseurship was paramount and perhaps backed up by wishful thinking rather than science.
So both of these, although it was science by the sounds of it that concluded that they were bunkum, it was originally connoisseurship. It was the eye, and the eye is still a very significant part of determining whether something is real or not. Yes, you can have provenance. Yes, you can have all sorts of technical insight, but it's still significant, particularly for old masters. We'd be looking at 18th century pictures here, less so for 20th century art, which is slightly more conceptual and has less to do with the fineness of craftsmanship very often. So I'm talking about the difference between Canaletto and a Canaletto studio, or a Bellotto, or a Turner from one of Turner's multifarious followers. And it's the eye that will very often tell you. And historically, that was probably the only thing that experts used. But now, increasingly, we've got other areas, other means by which we can determine whether something is right or not. And I thought I would indulge myself by giving you an example of a painting that I bought as a fledgling dealer in my late 20s. And it cleaned me out to try and buy it, or to buy it. Here it is. Now this is a sketch, clearly a sketch. You can see by the brushstrokes that it's unfinished. And it was described by Sotheby's about 30 years ago as a follower of, or manner of, or possibly style of, there's all sorts of rather euphemistic expressions, of the particular artist. And in this instance, it was John Constable. Now, I suspect a lot of you probably see it at a glance. So we're looking at what the auction house is described as a copy. Just a little bit about John Constable, a reminder. For many people in this room will know that he was born in the last quarter of the 18th century, and he was the first person to really conquer the British landscape. He conquered it with his eye. I think he once said that painting is just another word for feeling. And one of his great advances was sky. Was meteorology. He was familiar with all the treaties of the day. And up till this point, landscapes had very often just had formulaic skies, which are such an important part of the landscape. You know, bits of cotton wool floating around, some sort of standard prop. But he was the first person to really look and feel. You could feel the breeze in his strokes. And he's remarkable at that. Born in Suffolk, he then went on to become one of the great painters of his age, although not financially that successful. But his greatest works are often considered to be his sketches, those things that he did out in the open, with a brush, trying to capture nature on the move. And I have to say, I thought this was one of those. So I sunk £10,000 into it, which was basically all the money I had then. I was so sure that this could be proved to be a work by Constable. And not only that, but I felt that it was almost certainly a preparatory idea for the 1821 picture of, the Hayway. If I go back, there's Willie Lot. If I go back, you can see that it had to be from the other bank, because the Willie Lot's house is on the right, the cart's on the left. So, not necessarily a study for the Hayway. In a sense, that would be too obvious, but probably some type of thinking process by which he had then ended up with this fantastic, famous, picturesque biscuit tin, chocolate box solution. And so, full of excitement, I then, having established for my own idea, I thought it was right, I then took it down to show a historian in Bath who was now very ancient, but was known to have the great eye for custom, Ian Fleming Williams. I remember so well driving down the motorway, parking, and then he wanted to look at the car, the picture. He liked my car as well, actually, for about an hour. So I left him with the painting. And I was convinced by this time, I got myself into a love of excitement that this had to be a lost work. He was now very ancient. And I remember coming back, him opening the door, and before we could even have another chat, he just went straight into it. I'm sorry, this is not by the artist I know. This is not by, he didn't bother with Constable, he just said, this is not by John. And in those days, you didn't need to justify particularly, and so I was crestfallen. And I told a friend, who was also a client, who was also an emerging hedge fund manager, about this, and he said, well, let me have a look at it. I'll tell you what, I'll give you a profit. I'll give you twice what you paid for it. And I said, I promise you, one day I will try and prove it. But unfortunately, connoisseurship at that moment had broken down. And Ian Fleming Williams, the man who should have known, I felt was possibly, dare I say it, too old at that point to see what I was utterly convinced was the real deal.
When do you think things started to change, Philip?
Well, so much has happened in the last 15 or 20 years, and we're going to talk about science in a moment, but it's also provenance. We now can access the history of paintings so much better. We have an extraordinary, and I hardly need to say this, particularly to an audience like you, there is so much now that we can get to with the internet, about the internet, that we could never have dreamed of in the past. And I'm talking about, wills online, often pictures are mentioned in wills, inventories, the archives of art dealers, and so many more images. When I was studying art at university, I used mainly black and white photographs for Giotto and what have you. Now we can have fantastic close-up, showing the crackly or images of all the great artists. So it's allowed us to push deeper, and particularly in the area of provenance, trying to find out where things were, establish facts in a way that we never could before.
Which happens very much the same with architecture too, certainly in the mid-20th century, as I'm sure you all know. It was again very much on connoisseurship. The older generation of architectural historians say, oh, that's obviously by Van Brugh. And again, if so-and-so says it must be true. But now looking at provenance, we want documentary evidence to back that up. Some of those attributions are being dethroned.
So, even though we're dealing in a visual idiom, it is extraordinarily important to get the facts right, to do with provenance, if you can. And I have to say, it's the sort of evidence that a jury understands. You can have an expert witness, you can have a connoisseurship, you can have a scientist telling you that it has to be for the following reasons. But if you can plot where this picture was every day over the last 200 years to the moment it left the easel of the artist, it's pretty convincing. Which is why, 30 years on, I decided to return to this painting.
So this is a bit of an obsession, Billy.
Yeah.
Determined to be proved right.
So I convinced the BBC, even though it was my picture, it's always rather difficult talking about what was your own. I found it much easier talking about other people's sort of, aspirations and hopes rather than my own. But I was really keen to try and get this through. So I said, would you be up for going back and revisiting this picture that I saw? Because I think now we've got, as we just discussed, access to the past in a way we never had before. And so we got to this, yes, and we got to work. Now, I just think we're going to rapidly go through this. So, when I bought it, we did not know any provenance of this painting before 1967, when it was on loan to Los Angeles County Museum of Art. We were fortunate to be able to get to the archives of Los Angeles Museum of Art, who then were able to establish, because they needed to for their catalogue, that it came from the Arthur Tooth Gallery, whose archives could be found at the Tate Gallery. They've deposited them all there. They were a major dealer in the first half of the 20th century. As a result of establishing that, of going there, we were able to establish that they had bought the picture from a chap called Monty Bernard, who I remember, as a youngster. He was an ancient man and one of the wonderful art dealer, connoisseurial figure. I thought that was rather good. You see, this was just the type of person I would hope might have owned this. Monty Bernard, I can't remember quite how we got from Monty Bernard. I think we were told by someone who worked with him, bought a lot of pictures with Colnaghi's. Colnaghi's, the old master dealer's been going for 250 years or whatever, have now opened up their archives in their basement. So you can actually go in there with an appointment. And digging in, we were able to establish that they had bought it in November 1953 from a chap called Goldsmith, who was a dealer. But Goldsmith, the dealer, had put the provenance on it, and he bought it from a Mrs. Smith of Shenfield. You can imagine that was a damn.
That famous art.
So how are we going to get up? Well, of course, genealogy online, as we know, is astonishing. Astonishing. Had it just been a Mrs. Smith, obviously we'd be dead in the water. But a Mrs. Smith from Shenfield, yes, we were able to establish that her husband bought this picture. We were able to go to the archives of, I think it was Christie's, and he bought it at the sale of the late Sir Thomas Dewar of Dewar's Whiskey. Now, he was a very interesting art buyer, a very significant one. He owned Monarch of the Glen, and he would use pictures, particularly sort of cliche images, like our sketch, which he owned, because it looked like the hay wain, and Monarch of the Glen, which is precisely that type of thing. It looked good on a label, and he used them for marketing. It was beginning to happen at this time. Lord Leverhulme was doing that. Paul Sunlight for soap. Bubbles was a picture that falls into that category. Anyway, so now we had Dewar, and we looked into Dewar and where he was buying things, and sure enough, we found that he had bought it because he was the guy on the receipt. He had bought it at the Lionel Constable sale, Lionel being John Constable's son. We were now really, really close. And looking and analysing the John Constable sale pictures that Lionel sold, a number of them, including this, were from his father. We'd now got back to John Constable. And so a painting that I had sold for £20,000 as a spec, something that was in the ether, not in all the books, was now suddenly a significant, an exciting, a sort of uplifting first idea, rather like crossings out of a poet, but for a poem of what the hay wain should look like. It was also a £3 million picture. And that is showing you how provenance works, how connoisseurship can and cannot work as well. I'm not sure what the exact moral is from that. Perhaps you could give me one.
Well, also, I mean, when Philip mentioned the new price at the end, when you start to monetize this work, then things get very fraught and very complex, and often quite legalistic. And you've all seen examples of pictures that purport to be something they're not. Once again, the power of expectation, or even at a pose, you think that looks odd. Does that look like a engaged for a portrait or whatever. And you came across this with your Van Dyck example, didn't you? Which was very revealing.
So another way that we've made lots and lots of discoveries in the last 20 or 30 years is through restoration, conservation. It has now become so much more skillful than it ever was. We have got all sorts of ways, and we're going to come on to the forensics in a moment, by which one can tell what is real paint or what is added paint and what is the artist's core paint beneath. So many works of art have been overpainted, I can't tell you. Pretty well every painting over 200 years, if you look at it under a UV light, it's got blotches of later paint on it. But restorers are so much more adept. There's a greater range of chemical means and gels by which safely later paint can be removed, and virtuosity with a scalpel as well. I've seen that develop hugely over the last 20 years. And so it means that sometimes paintings literally buried by later paint or buried by poor restoration can sometimes be returned. And in some instances, pictures were deliberately painted in order to turn them into other things. And this came up at a sale in Christie's South Kensington about 20 years ago. Probably a bit less, actually, 15 years ago, now I think about it. And I remember we looked at it and thought, that head is extraordinarily good. It was described as a sort of follower or a manner of Van Dyck. Clearly, to my mind, it looked later. One could tell by the robes they were rather sort of soft, lacking the conviction of a sort of 17th century picture, just a little bit overly sort of self-conscious and romantic. But the head looked good. Henrietta Maria, of course, the consort of Charles I, and herself a great patron of Van Dyck. We bought it and looked deep into the pigments, and then we got one of our restorers to look into it, and they analysed the blue, and the blue was Prussian blue. Prussian blue, one of the first synthetic paints that wasn't invented until the early 18th century.
1702.
Oh,
I didn't know that. It's a rather sad fact. I have. It's useful for pub quizzes, but
well, and Van Dyck had died in the 1640s, so therefore that couldn't be right. But my God, the face looked good. So what we did was analyse it further, did a couple of tests, and bit by bit began to establish that this was originally a smaller picture. It had been extended on all edges, and a head and shoulder portrait had been turned into a 3/4 length in the 18th century by someone not understanding what they had, which I felt by looking at the face was unquestionably a work by the greatest 17th century portrait painter active in Britain, Sir Anthony Van Dyck. And here we have, this was a frightening process, I can tell you, because
this looks like some murder scene.
Sorry. So bit by bit, you can see we underneath the 18th century paint, and it's always a bit worrying, incidentally, and you could say ethically questionable to remove 18th century paint in order to find something earlier. But we knew that beneath was something not only better quality, but a good 50 years prior to this. So I made a decision just to crack on, and I'm really pleased we did. Oh God, how does that happen? Okay, well here we just go there. Okay, so there we have half emerging. What was that hand disappeared altogether. That's an 18th century edition, and here beneath was a late work of Henrietta Maria by Sir Anthony Van Dyck in the guise of St. Catherine. She's holding her wheel. And this is a work now that's in a major private collection, but frankly could never have been done had it not been for the confidence and the more sophisticated processes that have come about in the last 20 or 30 years in restoration and conservation. And I can name many, many examples, lots of works by George Rumney, for example, Thomas Lawrence, sketches that have been finished off and then no longer looking like the work of that particular artist, which have literally been raised from the dead as a result of solvents and scalpels. So that's one way that pictures, fakes if you want, or the non-picture becomes the real picture.
And that's also another thing that brings up is a different attitude, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, on the part of the owners, to their own pictures, that less reverence for what we will now call the great old masters. It's more about, where's it going to go? Oh, that's too big to fit between those two windows. Right, let's cut it down, throw away the bits. Or indeed, in this case, it's not big enough. Let's enlarge it. Let's make it into something different. It's almost that they're playpen. And obviously, this gets more complicated, doesn't it? The more fraught, the more revered the artist is, like Van Dyck. You've got wonderful Chagall example too, haven't you?
So I wanted to bring you deeper and further into the area of science. And this is analogous to the digital revolution that I've been talking about, is a very significant part of how we find things, discover things these days, or rather, let's put it a little bit more grimly, how we out things and fakes. And we have so much more data on artists than we ever had before. There's been wonderful work done by technically minded conservators who have collected, painted, and recorded the techniques of artists in a way that we never had before. We also have innumerable means in comparison to 50 years ago of looking into pictures without actually having to take the paint off. And that, non-invasive research is a really significant part of how we're able to determine whether something is real or not. And I just want to give you an extremely good example of this. So what I think, if I had to say in a nutshell why science is so important, it won't necessarily tell you if it's real or is what you want, in terms of the artist, but it can rule out the possibility of an artist.
There's still a role for judgment in the sense of how science is used.
Indeed, but it's never completely conclusive in my experience on its own. But what it will give you very often, if you know the materials and when they were invented and what have you, is a terminus post quem, the earliest possible date that it can be. So this picture here was brought to us by a couple. This was for one of our programs. In fact, it was a father and son, and they had bought it for £100,000. And this purported to be a 1915 period painting by Marc Chagall. When he was in Belarus, he was a Jewish Russian artist who then made it to Paris, and the rest is history, known particularly for his sort of surreal dreamscape paintings. But this purported to be an early work. And they were confident because it was in a book in Russian, illustrated as a work of around about that period. But when they actually looked into it a little bit further, having bought it and having had it on their wall for a bit, and then they got another copy of the book, they found that the image had been omitted from the second edition of the book. And that rather worried them, and that was why we got involved. And it was a fascinating process. I have to say, it did worry me. Here's the connoisseurship bit. Obviously one is looking at a highly modernist idiom, a sort of, rather like Picasso, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, sort of period, 1915, the word we don't use now that was used then, a primitivist style of painting. And so it was clearly trying to be something, but I just felt it didn't quite work. She just looked a bit cross-eyed, and so that worried me. But then, over the course of a lot of research, which was beginning to look less and less, making the painting less and less convincing, we then subjected it to Raman spectroscopy. So this was a process that was invented in, I think, 1930, for which Raman got C.V. Raman got a Nobel Prize. And it shoots light into pigments, and now it's done with laser. It wasn't then. And then how the sort of the binding elements within the pigments then react and respond is a way of telling what one material is from another. I mean, as you can tell, I'm not a scientist, but it's fascinating to see it work. And this was subjected to that, and up came, having looked at all the blue, an unequivocal diagnosis. This was phthalocyanine blue. Now, this painting was meant to be 1915. Phthalocyanine blue wasn't invented until the early 1930s. That was a complete gotcha. So the painting was tragically, we made the case, put all the details in the hope that possibly Chagall in the 70s might decide to do a sort of, or 50s, 60s, 70s, had decided to go back and be like the young man he was in the 1910s, you know, a sort of weird retrospective stylistic piece. We sent all the evidence to the Chagall committee with the picture, and the answer came back no. Also came back another answer, incidentally, which I have to say I'm not proud about, because we should have actually looked into it further. They said, with the powers of French law, we've now decided to destroy it. And that was a terrible moment for us. So we still don't know whether it has been destroyed, but they do have this power in France. It's a vicious process, because I think, as a result, a lot of fakes that might be fake now, but may not be in the future, or are useful because they're fakes, are destroyed. They're burnt in front of a magistrate. You think of it, it's so Robespierre, isn't it? So there you are. But anyway, so that was a very, very interesting cut and dry case of how science was able to give us a terminus post quem, and we ruled it out. And there it is in a puff of smoke.
So Philip, what we've been looking at is you know, the growing role of provenance, and of course in recent years the huge role that science has to play, making the forger's task far more difficult. Yet, you know, forgery is still, is it again the power of expectation? Why are forgers still being successful, despite the fact that science is raged against them, that there's the emphasis on, rightly, on provenance?
Yeah, absolutely, but because the fakers are getting clever. It's an arms race. You see, they can get the information that those who try and deduce whether it's real or not use. They can get to the data. They can actually now, because of digital technology, they can fake provenance. They can get labels, make labels. I've seen many fake labels. So yeah, we've progressed, but so has the dark side.
It all comes back to Star Wars. Philip, it would be a great shame if we didn't mention in passing the new series 11 of Fake or Fortune. But never mind, there we are. Philip, if you want to press the next button, and we'll see you. The new series, as you said, comes out next week. Obviously, we can't ask you to give us the punchlines, and that would undermine the wonderful stories you'll be telling. But is there anything you can hint about what's coming up in the new series?
So this is Vera and Ida's scrap metal yard in Colchester, where Tuesday's
It's lots of romantic places.
It was actually rather romantic, actually, funnily enough, in a sort of, not in the Fiona sense, but in the sort of artistic sense. It was a sort of futuristic dreamscape of scrap metal. And the reason we were there was because this piece of metal that we were holding in our hands had been bought by a lady who wrote to us about a year and a half ago in a car boot sale in Colchester. And she negotiated it down for 90 quid. And it was apparently retrieved from a scrap metal yard, which is why we started the programme there. And she ran it under a tap. Up came the name Elizabeth Frick. And let me just go to the piece. Elizabeth Frick. And she did a bit of research, the lady who bought it, and then wrote to the Elizabeth Frick Committee, sending a photograph. As people do, you can access expertise now very easily. And they said, this looks interesting. This looks like a sculpture or a series of 10 that she did in the mid-1950s called Small Warrior. What is the provenance? And she said, well, a car boot set in Colchester. And basically the conversation ended there. And so she came to us. And so what we then did was, over the course of a couple of months, is to subject this to all the research that we could, which also involved, and there are two in Oxford, trying to find every other version of this in a private or public collection, in order to be able to with any luck, ascertain that this was a missing one. And we were able to narrow it down reasonably significantly. Make up your own mind when the program comes out. But what we were able to do, and this was totally new for me, and I have to say really exciting, I didn't know that bronze had so much personality. This is made from bronze. So bronze being alloy is analogous to a cake mixture. There's various ingredients, and they vary according to the person who's made the piece of bronze, which means you can actually sometimes get back by analysis the piece of bronze to, by comparing it to another piece of bronze, you can get back to the ingot for where it came, because that's what you can do, because they're all different, a bit like a cake, so different. And then sometimes you can take it back one stage further to the artist, particularly when you have a whole load of other versions. So by the end of the program, and I still wasn't, sure whether it was real or not, we used this real hardcore science in Oxford. Help me with it. Metallurgical.
Yeah,
metallurgical
with
science.
metals.
So treating a piece of bronze like paint. We also did various measuring in order to compare the measurements of this to the other versions, because fakes are either going to be a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller, depending on what might be done. Got together all the evidence, and she was, the woman who bought it, was on tenterhooks throughout. And do you know what the answer is? You're going to have to look at the program.
Got you.
Tuesday night, 8 o'clock, I think.
So
BBC One.
To be continued. Thank you so much, Philip. We've got a little time now for questions. If anyone has any, please raise your hands. We have an ambulatory mic, but please wait till the mic gets to you. If you have an online question, my colleagues from Kellogg will be fielding those too. So, lady at the front, Alex, in the group.
Thank you very much. That's so interesting. Philip, I was wondering, your personal experience of being told that your beloved sketch was not a Constable, and then years later finding out that it was, what impact has that had on you in terms of how you approach the people who bring their beloved treasures to you?
What an interesting question. I think it's reminded me of something which I think is terribly important, and perhaps I should have actually made clearer. And that is, what is deemed a fake in one generation need not necessarily. It is. Sorry, not closer. What it proves, I think, is something which I think is very significant, and that is, what is deemed a fake in one generation need not necessarily be so in the next. And what's happening is that expertise is moving all the time. We're learning so much more. We're seeing so much more. Going back to that point I was talking to you about digital photography. Those 1930s art historians who went around Italy had to keep things in their head, or occasionally they get really black and white photographs from the back of a church. Now we can see and find out so much more. So my message, the message I would take away from that, and I think I use it with other people, is we might not have pulled it off now, but if I do feel the picture's right, I just say hang on in there. And there've been 2 or 3 examples. So it's not over when the experts in this sort of Procrustean way say it doesn't fit.
So don't give up hope.
Oh yeah, thank you. Absolutely fascinating talk. I'm intrigued to know what the denouement of your Van Dyke story is, because you identify the original smaller picture. So do you destroy the old one? And what is then the original? And there's things like the frame. I mean, what's the final outcome of that story?
Okay. Hello? Okay, let's start with the frame. So it was a nice 18th century 50 times 40 inch standard frame. That would be used for another painting. The paint surface, of course, was removed with scalpels all around, and beneath was basically nothing. So the canvas may well be used by the restorer for testing. It's often old canvases are given to schools, restoration, conservation studios to learn from. The stretcher bars on the back are probably turned into firewood. Any labels conserved, very important to keep that from the provenance point of view. But I think you could say rather sustainably got rid of the rest.
Yes.
What's the justification for charging millions for a painting that's authentic? And the artist himself might have been struck with a garret when he's been painting, but nothing out of it.
I mean, it's a very good point. We now have for artists born in the last who died within the last 75 years, a thing called artist resale rights, where every time a painting is sold, the estate gets, or the artist's family gets up to 4%. But further back, yeah, it's a sadness. But I'd like to think that the artists looking down, when they see their works, which weren't necessarily appreciated during their lifetime, are being hallowed as the sort of modern equivalent of holy relics. They might actually have a bit of a smile on their face.
That's very optimistic. Very good point. I mean, in the last series of The Fatal Fortune, if you remember the Alfred Sisley case, which is still, we could talk about that more. But Sisley, again, one of those wonderful painters who, as you say, his canvases go for millions now, died a pauper, and looking back in art history, it's often the case that perhaps some of the second division, more clubbable, slightly one might say more conservative artists, were better known, more famous, more successful in their time. What would you rather be, a second division artist who actually makes lots of money or reasonable amount of money in his or her time, or only be lauded after your death, as Philip said? So it's, yeah, it is a crying shame that people like Sisley were unable to enjoy the fruits of their labour, so to speak. Yeah, just on the right there.
Thank you. Here's a very naive question. I'm sure it's easily answered. Why should the artistic or financial value of a piece of art depend on its provenance? If it apparently looks so fine and can fool a significant number of people, and it takes spectroscopy and all sorts of other clever scientific techniques to tell the truth, why does that make it uninteresting? Why does that diminish its artistic value?
Can I start that? I mean, this is very much a question, Philip. Very good point. I mean, as I said, with the example of Turl Street at the beginning, it doesn't make it, in a way, often it makes it, in some senses, more interesting. And it's a valid piece of art. But if the monetization of that work of art is dependent on an association with a well-known artist, we get back to that simple effect of honesty. You've lost the honesty there.
And I think, in a sense, the opposite of beauty and art is sort of dishonesty and fraudulence. And this is going to sound a little bit sophistical, but I do think that a work of art is more than just its appearance. I think there is a moral dimension to art and beauty. If you ever sit and watch, as I've done many times in the National Gallery, the way people or the tape, people engage with paintings, they will look at the painting for half a second, then they'll look at the label. In other words, what they're told about it, the fact that it's on the wall, the fact that it has that attribution, and then they return to look at the painting for 45 seconds. Is an indivisible part of their visual perception. And I also use the analogy of the holy relic, okay, because a lot of these people, Van Gogh is a saint, a secular saint. I think you need to know that the knuckle of St. Barnabas is true and honest, and then you're prepared to kneel in front of it. So there's a sort of suspension of disbelief that seems to. I think it goes into this. And one final point, and that is, I was just looking at a Princess Diana dress, which you could have bought, probably still buy second hand, and not the one she wore, for something like £300, make £100,000. And that is because we know that she wore it. But the dress doesn't look any different, but that aroma of provenance and history is rather like the relic, rather like the label next to the picture, I think is a really significant part of the aesthetic process. That's just me. But it's, it's a good question, actually. I mean, you thought it was a simple one. It's not.
Anyone? Yes, just up on the window.
Now we've got all these techniques, spectroscopy and X-ray, etc. I understand that in the past the old masters used to employ other people to actually do other work on the paintings. Are you able to determine which part was done by the master and which part was done by his assistants?
That's such a good question, and it's one that bedevils so many of us who buy art. Are we dealing with the work of the master, or are we dealing with a studio? I mean, in the case of people like Van Dyck or Reynolds, I mean, they have such a sophisticated band of collaborators doing everything and using, in many instances, not all, the same paints. Although, actually, the more we're looking into this, it appears that Reynolds might have used different, more expensive pigments than his assistants. But it's very, very difficult. And that comes back to, which we cannot lose sight of. And I would hate you to go away from this talk thinking that the eye is no longer important. It is very significant, connoisseurship. And if I put you next to a Van Dyck where all the drapery is by him, and then next to it you saw a work by the studio, you would see in a jiffy what I meant. He can never be boring, Van Dyck, but his studio can.
Yeah, and it raises, just as said, raising the whole area of the role of the artist. The artist as the creator, something that people like Vasari in the Renaissance really emphasised, the single creative well, as Philip said. Lots of artists, particularly up to, say, the early 19th century, used studios, used assistants. Lily and Nella both had a sort of assembly line, if you like. They did the face and the hands, and the studio did everything else. And then off it went to the drapery painter, and off it went to the landscape painter. So the idea of one single artist, certainly until you get to the sort of early, the modern era, the later 18th, early 19th century, it wasn't always all by one particular artist. And as Philip says, then one does fall back almost mercifully on one's own eye and the eye of experts. Yeah, right at the back.
Oh, a tried question here. Who was the hedge fund manager that helped you out?
See me later. Actually, no, I can't tell you that. Actually, because are you a hedge fund?
I dabble.
You dabble a bit. Yes, that's how he described it. Well, I mean, I say hedge fund. He did a lot of sort of, a lot of wheeling and dealing. His name is Henry Reed. He was on the show. We met him, and he specialises in European stocks. That's it.
Yeah, for one more on the right-hand side of the two there, but then we'll get thank you, and then start.
Just a quick forensics question. So you say the process of kind of revealing what's underneath an old painting is to use a scalpel, and I forgot the other product, maybe a solvent. How do you do that? Like, how do you not mess up the original?
Well, you put your finger on the definition of really high quality restoration, or one of the definitions. And that is the art of being able to take off what shouldn't be there, and that includes varnish as well as overpaint. Sometimes 2 or 3 campaigns of overpaint for a picture that's been there a long time, without disturbing or damaging the layer beneath. And sometimes it can only be done mechanically, i.e. through scalpels. But I have noticed over the last 10 years an increasing sophistication of the use of chemicals, particularly chemicals or solvents that are suspended in gel and don't remove as violently as a swab would on the end of a stick, the layer of top paint. Microscopes are used, a lot of deliberation, a lot of thought. I mean, it is the essence of restoration of old pictures, really, that particular attribute.
So as they used to say on BBC, please don't do this at home. Yeah, the bucket of vim and the scrubbing. That's much good idea. Time for one last question, just at the back.
Would you, there's a suggestion, would you not want to suggest to the French government, instead of destroying the fakes, they could open a museum for fakes for people to understand by themselves and have a fair knowledge of what exactly a fake would look like?
It's obviously a terrifically good point there. There's never really a case for destroying a work of art, even if it's deemed not to be the real thing. It's the similar argument, if this doesn't sound too inappropriate, to the death sentence. It may be that society feels it's appropriate, but you cannot take the risk. And because you never know what innocence might come out of the woodwork. So it shouldn't be done, you're right. And yes, I rather like that as sort of an alternative salon de refusé. A chamber of horrors.
We'll set one up here. Can I draw things to a close now? Thank you all very much for coming. Thank all my wonderful colleagues at Kellogg College for creating such a wonderful weekend of talks and events and dinners. Please do tune in to find out what happened to the Fringe. But also, a huge thank you, please. Could you put your hands together for Philip, a really entertaining.